The afternoon sun was merciless, spilling golden heat over the city skyline as Jordan Ellis, a woman who had built her name from the ground up, stepped out of her sleek black car in front of Sterling National Bank. She wore a crisp navy suit tailored to perfection, her natural curls pinned into a bun, her every step exuding quiet authority. But despite her commanding presence, she knew what usually came first in these places: the way people judged skin before credentials, appearance before achievement. Inside, the bank buzzed with the low murmur of customers waiting in line and the sharp clatter of keyboards from tellers at their counters. Jordan moved with certainty, heels clicking against the marble floor as she approached. She had come for something simple, a withdrawal from her personal account. Nothing unusual, nothing outside of what countless customers did daily. But as she handed her ID and account number to the teller, a young man whose stiff smile betrayed an edge of condescension, Jordan noticed the way his eyes darted quickly across her face and then back to the card. There it was, the flicker of doubt, the silent question that seemed to ask, "How could someone like you have an account like this?" He cleared his throat, typing into his computer, his expression twisting slightly. "This seems to be a mistake," he murmured under his breath, but not low enough for her to miss it. Jordan arched an eyebrow, her patience already thinning. "A mistake?" she asked evenly, voice low and steady. He glanced at her again, suspicion in his gaze. "The amount you're asking to withdraw, it doesn't align with what we'd expect from, well, someone in your position." The words hung in the air, sharp and insulting. Around them, a few customers shifted, their curiosity piqued. Jordan's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure, offering the man nothing but silence. The teller straightened his posture, as if emboldened by his own doubt, lowering his voice to a whisper meant to diminish her. "I'll need to escalate this to my manager," he said, already shaking his head as if he had already decided her request was fraudulent. Within moments, a middle-aged manager with a clipped walk and eyes that screamed arrogance appeared. His tone was sharper, colder. "Ma'am, we'll need to ask you to step aside. We don't usually see this kind of transaction from clients like yourself. Perhaps you should reconsider your request before we involve security." The implication was clear. They saw her as a threat, a liar, someone unworthy of handling her own wealth. Jordan inhaled slowly, holding the fire in her chest, her mind running back through every time she'd been underestimated, dismissed, or judged. This was different, though. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know that the very foundation beneath their feet, the company name etched into the walls, all of it, in some capacity, belonged to her. She studied the cluster forming around her. The bank staff whispering, the customers watching with a mix of unease and curiosity. And though her pride screamed for her to snap back, Jordan only offered a calm, almost disarming smile. She knew this wasn't the moment to unleash the truth. That would come later. For now, she let them underestimate her, let them build the stage with their ignorance. Because when she finally chose to reveal it, the silence that followed would be deafening. Jordan could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing against her as the manager's words cut through the air, laced with prejudice and arrogance. The hum of the bank seemed to grow quieter, as though the entire lobby held its breath, waiting to see how the scene would unfold. She stood there, still and composed, while the manager and the teller exchanged smug glances, their silent confidence feeding off each other. "Ma'am," the manager continued with an exaggerated patience that dripped condescension, "large withdrawals require verification. And frankly, in situations like this, we have to be especially careful." He emphasized the word "this," letting it hang like a blade, his meaning clear. Jordan's lips pressed into a thin line as memories flickered in her mind, moments in boardrooms where men twice her age had laughed when she introduced herself as CEO, dinners where waiters had handed the check to her assistant instead of her, conferences where she had been mistaken for a secretary despite being the keynote speaker. Each humiliation had built an armor around her, but the sting of being diminished never fully dulled. Today, in this bank, they thought they had cornered her, stripped her of dignity in front of strangers. "Verification?" she repeated softly, tilting her head. "Of what?" My identity? My account? Or your assumption that I don't belong here? Her voice was calm, but its steadiness only seemed to irritate him further. The manager smirked, leaning closer, his voice a low hiss meant to intimidate. Let's not make this difficult. If you can't provide proof of employment, additional references, and explain the source of these funds, I'll have no choice but to alert the authorities. Fraud is a serious crime, and people get into very deep trouble for attempting it. The teller chuckled under his breath, quickly suppressing it, but Jordan caught it. A ripple of discomfort spread among the customers. Some looked away, unwilling to confront the ugliness unfolding. Others, however, leaned in, sensing the tension, eager to witness the drama. Jordan felt her pulse quicken, but her outward calm remained unbroken. She knew that lashing out now would only feed into the stereotype they silently imposed upon her. Instead, she allowed their arrogance to build higher, brick by brick, like a fragile wall she could topple with a single push. The security guard, a tall man with a heavy build, had begun to approach, his hand resting near his belt as if he were already preparing for an escalation. Jordan could see the story forming in their minds. A black woman causing trouble, resisting the rules, daring to demand what didn't belong to her. The injustice burned like fire in her veins. But she also knew something they didn't. She wasn't powerless here. She wasn't just another customer in their system. She was the system. And the higher they pushed this humiliation, the harder the fall would be when the truth dropped. She breathed in deeply, met the manager's eyes, and said in a voice as smooth as glass, "Call whoever you need to. I'm not leaving until I get what I came for." Her defiance, quiet but resolute, shifted the air. A few customers straightened, sensing there was more to her than what they saw. The manager, however, smirked again, mistaking her composure for desperation. "Then prepare yourself," he said coldly, motioning for the guard, "because the next step isn't going to be pleasant." Jordan's fingers brushed against her phone in her pocket, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. If they wanted verification, she was ready to give it in a way that would shake the walls of this building. The moment the manager gestured to the guard, the atmosphere in the bank shifted entirely. Tension spread through the room like a ripple in water, customers whispering nervously, some reaching for their phones, half expecting a scene to unfold. The guard's heavy footsteps echoed across the marble floor, his face unreadable, but his posture already leaning toward force rather than understanding. Jordan stood perfectly still, her hands relaxed at her sides, the very image of calm, but beneath the surface her thoughts raced, not with fear, but with calculation. Every second of this humiliation was fuel, every word they spoke was rope they unknowingly tied around their own necks. "Ma'am," the guard said gruffly, his voice practiced, rehearsed, "you need to step aside and cooperate with management. Failure to do so may result in removal from the premises." Jordan met his eyes steadily, her voice measured, unwavering. "I've cooperated fully. What I asked for is within my rights. What your manager is doing is discrimination disguised as protocol." The guard stiffened, unused to such composure. He looked back at the manager for instruction, and the man quickly stepped in, puffing his chest with self-importance. "This isn't about discrimination, it's about protecting the bank," he said, his tone loud enough for everyone to hear. "We can't just hand over large sums to anyone who walks in claiming to own them. For all we know, she could have stolen someone's identity. These things happen." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some frowned, some nodded, and a few shook their heads in disapproval. Jordan could see the scene unraveling exactly as the manager wanted. Her cast as the villain, him as the protector. She could have stopped it with a single sentence with the truth she carried, but she chose not to, not yet. Timing mattered. The humiliation was unbearable, yes, but the silence that would follow her revelation needed to be absolute. Slowly, deliberately, Jordan slid her hand into her pocket and pulled out her phone. The guard tensed, but she merely raised her brow at him, dismissing his assumption. With a few swift taps, she scrolled to a name that always carried weight, her chief financial officer, Marcus Lane. She hit dial and lifted the phone to her ear. The manager's smirk faltered slightly as he realized she wasn't panicking but making a calculated move. The phone rang twice before Marcus answered, his voice brisk, professional. "Jordan, everything all right?" His use of her first name drew a flicker of confusion across the manager's face. Jordan spoke, evenly, though her words were laced with steel. "Marcus, I'm at Sterling National. They're refusing my withdrawal. They've implied fraud, threatened to call the authorities, and they've brought security. I'd like this handled immediately." Silence followed on the other end for only a second before Marcus replied, his tone sharp. "Say no more. I'll make some calls. Stay put." She hung up without another word, slipping her phone back into her pocket, her gaze locking on the manager's pale face. He tried to laugh it off, straightening his tie. "Whoever you think you're calling won't change protocol, ma'am," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. Jordan's lips curved into the faintest smile, one that promised the storm he had just summoned on himself. She knew Marcus wouldn't waste a second. The chairman of Sterling's board would be informed within minutes, and from there the truth would tumble down like an avalanche. The people humiliating her had no idea they were staring at the woman who owned the very walls around them. And when the truth came crashing in, they would wish they had chosen their words more carefully. The minutes that followed Jordan's call stretched like hours, each tick of the clock echoing against the polished marble walls, each glance from the crowd pressing harder against the fragile arrogance of the bank staff. The manager tried to maintain his composure, barking quiet instructions to the teller and motioning for the guard to remain close, but there was a tremor in his movements now, the slightest crack in his once unshakable confidence. Jordan stood unmoved, her posture calm, her face unreadable, though inside she felt the building anticipation of the inevitable shift that was about to rock the room. The other customers whispered among themselves, some disgusted at the way she was being treated, others too afraid or indifferent to intervene. But the air was charged, heavy, as if everyone sensed that this was not an ordinary dispute between customer and bank. The manager finally leaned toward her again, voice dripping with the same condescension as before. "You may think your little phone call will change something, but the fact remains, until you prove otherwise, you don't belong here. People like you," he stopped short, realizing the venom in his phrasing had slipped too far, but the damage was done. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the lobby as his words registered with the listeners. Jordan simply tilted her head, a smile ghosting across her lips, but she didn't respond. She didn't need to. His words had spoken louder than anything she could have said in that moment. Then, just as the silence began to feel unbearable, the glass doors of the bank swung open with a force that drew every head toward the entrance. Marcus Lane himself strode in, flanked by two sharply dressed assistants. His presence was like a tidal wave, calm but unstoppable, and the confidence in his stride immediately commanded attention. The manager's face drained of color as he recognized him, stammering, "Mr. Lane, sir, we were just—" But Marcus cut him off with a single raised hand, his voice a razor's edge. "Save it." He turned directly to Jordan, his expression softening only for her. "Jordan, I came as quickly as I could. I've already alerted the board." The murmurs in the crowd rose into a collective gasp as realization began to dawn. Who was this woman? Who could summon the CFO of the bank with a single call? Jordan gave a small nod, her voice calm but tinged with a quiet power. "Thank you, Marcus. I knew you'd understand the urgency." The manager stuttered, his face beat, red now, but Marcus's glare silenced him before he could attempt an excuse. Turning to the staff, Marcus's tone became ice. "Do you have any idea who you've been humiliating here? Do you have the faintest clue whose authority you've just questioned?" The teller shifted uncomfortably, the guard took a step back, and the manager swallowed hard, his arrogance collapsing in on itself. Still, Jordan remained silent, letting Marcus's words hang heavy in the air, letting the weight of anticipation build until it threatened to crush the entire room. Everyone, staff, customers, even the guard, leaned forward, waiting for the revelation that they somehow knew was coming, and Jordan, calm as the eye of a storm, knew the moment had finally come to let the truth fall. The lobby had grown so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning filled the room, punctuated only by the nervous shifting of shoes against the polished floor. Jordan stood tall, her eyes fixed calmly on the manager whose smugness had finally curdled into fear, and for the first time since entering the bank, she allowed her voice to carry with the weight of her true identity. You've accused me of fraud, threatened me with removal, and humiliated me in front of a room full of strangers, she began, her tone smooth but edged with steel. And all the while, you never thought to ask who I am. Not really. She paused deliberately, letting her words sink into the uneasy silence. The manager fumbled, his hands twitching as if reaching for words that wouldn't come. Who are you then? He managed to stammer, his bravado long dissolved. Jordan's lips curled into a smile that was equal parts elegance and fire. I am Jordan Ellis, CEO of Ellis Holdings. And Ellis Holdings, she said, her voice rising now, echoing off the high ceilings of the lobby, is the majority shareholder of Sterling National Bank. Meaning she swept her hand slowly toward the gleaming logo etched into the wall behind the counters. You work for me. The gasp that followed was collective and visceral, a wave of shock that rolled through the room. Customers leaned forward, wide-eyed, whispering in disbelief, while the staff froze in stunned silence. The teller's mouth fell open, his earlier smugness wiped clean, replaced with an expression of sheer panic. The manager staggered back, half a step as though struck, his face ashen. Even the guard, once firm and ready to enforce orders, now stood awkwardly, shifting his weight with sudden discomfort. Marcus stepped closer then, his expression hard as he fixed his gaze on the manager. You've not only insulted our CEO, you've embarrassed this institution. Every word you spoke, every threat you made, is a stain on the very bank you claim to protect. The manager opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, only a pathetic sputter as he realized the depth of his mistake. Jordan, however, wasn't finished. She turned slowly, addressing the entire lobby, her voice clear, commanding. This is what happens when bias clouds judgment. This is what happens when you look at someone and decide their worth before knowing who they are. Today, it was me. Tomorrow, it could be any one of you. Her words struck harder than any revelation of power could have, because they carried not just authority, but truth. And as she stood there, the weight of her ownership undeniable, the bank itself seemed to shrink around her, its staff suddenly exposed for what they were, small-minded, prejudiced, and utterly unprepared for the storm they had invited upon themselves. The fallout was immediate. The manager, pale and sweating, stammered an apology, so clumsy it only made the silence heavier. I had no idea. Ms. Ellis, please. This was a misunderstanding. I only meant to, but Marcus cut him off sharply. Save your excuses. You didn't care who she was until now. You saw a black woman and decided she didn't belong in her own bank. That isn't a misunderstanding. That's systemic prejudice. The crowd, emboldened by the spectacle, began murmuring louder, some even recording the exchange on their phones. The manager's eyes darted nervously toward the lenses pointed at him, his career unraveling in real time. Jordan, however, remained calm, her expression steady, her power not in raised volume, but in unshakable composure. You will step down, she said, her tone quiet but absolute. The manager froze, blinking rapidly as though he hadn't heard correctly. What? Effective immediately, Jordan continued, her words slicing through him like glass, you are relieved of your duties. Sterling National has no place for leadership built on prejudice. Consider this your last act as a manager, humiliating your own employer. Gasps rippled again, and this time the whispers in the lobby carried a tone of awe. The teller who had mocked her earlier sank into his chair, his head lowered in shame, while the guard quietly stepped back, no longer willing to involve himself. Jordan turned her gaze toward the teller, her eyes narrowing just enough to make him squirm. And you, she said firmly, you will undergo retraining. If you fail to complete it successfully, you will not return to this desk. The teller swallowed hard, nodding rapidly, muttering a yes, ma'am, under his breath. Marcus leaned toward Jordan then, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You've made your point. Do you want to take this private?" But Jordan shook her head. "No," she whispered back, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person who has ever been treated like they don't belong. They need to see that it can be confronted, that it can be stopped." And so she stood her ground in full view of everyone, her words carrying the kind of weight that didn't just punish, it transformed. For the first time, the humiliation wasn't hers to carry. It belonged to the very people who had tried to strip her of dignity, and now, stripped of theirs, they had no place left to hide. By the time Jordan left the bank that day, the world, outside those glass doors, already knew what had happened. Videos had spread across social media within minutes, capturing her calm revelation, the manager's collapse, and her final words that cut deeper than any corporate memo ever could. Headlines began to form before she even reached her car. Black CEO owns bank that tried to humiliate her. Bias backfires at Sterling National. Jordan Ellis delivers public lesson in power. But Jordan wasn't thinking about the headlines. As she settled into the back seat of her car, the city buzzing around her, she thought about the years of struggle that had led to this moment. Every closed door, every laugh in a boardroom, every time she had been told she wasn't good enough, smart enough, or simply didn't belong, all of it had brought her here, to this stage, where her very existence was the rebuttal. Marcus sat beside her, still bristling from the confrontation. "You handled that with more grace than I would have," he admitted. Jordan gave a small, tired smile. "Grace is the weapon they never expect you to have. Anger they're ready for. But grace? Grace leaves them with nothing to fight back against." She looked out the window as the car pulled away, watching the bank shrink into the distance. She knew the institution would survive the scandal. Banks always did. But its staff would never forget the day their arrogance was dismantled by the very person they sought to demean. And beyond the walls of Sterling, countless others who watched the video would carry her example forward, reminded that power isn't always loud and ownership isn't just about money, it's about owning your place, your worth, and your truth. Jordan leaned back against the seat, exhaling slowly, a deep satisfaction blooming within her. She hadn't just withdrawn money that day. She had withdrawn the mask of prejudice, torn it from faces too comfortable in their assumptions. And in doing so, she hadn't just shaken a bank. She had shaken an entire system that thrived on underestimating people like her.